Today, we're talking about a huge policy shift that could totally redefine Canada's economic future. It's a story about tariffs, trade, and a really bold move that caught pretty much everyone, especially Washington, completely by surprise. This is the story of Canada's steel fortress.
Okay, let's just dive right into this quote, because this one line from a journalist really captures the earthquake that happened on November 26, 2025. You see, for decades, the playbook was simple. When the U.S. puts on the economic pressure, Canada negotiates. Everyone was sure that a 50% tariff on steel would bring the industry to its knees. But this time, this wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a declaration of independence.
So, to really get our heads around this steel fortress, we're going to break it down into 6 parts. We'll look at the big announcement, the 75-year-old habit it totally shattered, the trap it was designed to get out of, how the fortress was built, what it's going to cost, and finally, what this new reality looks like for Canada. All right, let's start on that day, November 26, 2025. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney gives a speech that basically tears up a 75-year-old playbook. And you can bet Washington was not expecting it. Look, everyone thought Canada had no choice but to fold under this massive U.S. trade pressure. The expectation was they'd ask for some kind of relief. That is not what happened. Instead, Carney rolled out a plan to basically rewire the entire Canadian economy from the inside out. He took Trump's economic weapon and turned it into the very thing that would kickstart an industrial revival. Now, to really get how radical this was, we need to understand the old system. For 3 whole generations, Canada's entire economic identity was built on one single idea. And it wasn't just a policy, it was a deeply ingrained national habit.
For 75 years, Canada's prosperity was all tied to this one belief, that the American market was its biggest and most reliable asset, period. From the Auto Pact to NAFTA, everything was designed to make that relationship deeper. The psychological impact of that was huge. Being next to the U.S. was seen as Canada's #1 economic advantage. So, Trump's tariffs, they didn't just hurt businesses, they shattered that core belief. So yeah, that 75-year habit got completely blown up when President Trump brought back these punishing 50% tariffs on Canadian steel. This was supposed to be a checkmate move, right? But it had this unintended consequence. It forced Canada to take a really hard look in the mirror at its own supply chains. And what it found was a vulnerability that was just as ridiculous as it was dangerous. With their biggest customer suddenly locked out, Canadian steel producers, who still have to keep their furnaces running, by the way, started asking a really simple but profound question. Canada still needs steel for its own stuff, bridges, pipelines, buildings. So if our own steel isn't being used, whose steel is? And the answer was, frankly, embarrassing. About half the steel being used inside Canada was coming from countries that Canada had no free trade deal with at all. We're talking China, India, Brazil. And these imports, they faced almost no penalties as long as they stayed under these quotas that nobody was really enforcing that hard. I mean, think about how absurd this is. You've got Canadian steel workers losing their jobs because they're locked out of the U.S., but at the exact same time, they're losing their own home market to foreign competition that's just flooding in. It was a 1-2 punch that made the old way of doing things completely indefensible. The back door had been left wide open. And this is where Carney's plan, which people started calling Fortress North, comes in. It's a 3-part strategy, and it's not just about defending Canadian industry. It's about building a whole new, more self-reliant system. It's cool, it's calculated, and it's totally focused on results. The policy basically works in 3 stages. First, it's got to shut that back door on foreign steel from countries without a trade deal. Second, it has to tackle the insane cost of moving stuff across Canada's massive landscape. And third, it gives direct help to other key industries, like lumber, that have been getting beaten up by U.S. protectionism for years. Okay, so step 1, and this was dramatic. The government just slammed that back door shut. The policy was, well, elegant in its brutality. It immediately slashed the import quota for countries without a free trade deal. The threshold dropped from 50% of the previous year's levels all the way down to just 20%. So, what does this actually mean? Well, this one change instantly carves out over $750 million in domestic demand. This isn't a handout, it's an order. It's a clear signal that from now on, Canadian demand is going to be met by Canadian supply first. It gives our own producers a real fighting chance in their own backyard. Second, the plan tackled geography. You're not going to believe this, but it used to cost more to move a ton of steel from Hamilton, Ontario to a construction site in British Columbia than it did to ship it all the way from Shanghai. So Ottawa brought down the hammer again. Interprovincial freight rates for steel were to be cut by 50%.
And if the railways couldn't do it for that price, the government would pay the difference. All of a sudden, buying Canadian isn't just patriotic, it's the cheapest, smartest option.
And third, a huge support fund was set up for the softwood lumber industry. This is another part of the economy that's been battered by U.S. tariffs for decades. This $1.2 billion fund is designed to keep mills open, retrain workers, and help the industry find new customers in places like Britain, Europe, and Asia.
But come on, a policy this bold, it's not going to fly without some serious criticism. This might not be old-school nationalism, but it is a form of protectionism, and that always comes with costs and risks that we have to talk about.
The critics basically have four big arguments. 1. Construction companies are worried about paying more for domestic steel. 2. People who watch the budget are calling the freight subsidy a really dangerous precedent. 3. Trade lawyers are worried other countries might retaliate or file complaints. And 4. The free market purists argue this is all just delaying the inevitable. You're stopping money from flowing to new, more innovative industries.
And this really gets to the heart of the whole debate. The critique is, you're just propping up an old industry, you're delaying progress. But the defense is just as powerful. Steel isn't just another product. It's not a widget. It's essential for national defense, for energy, for infrastructure. From this point of view, relying on foreign steel isn't about being efficient. It's a massive strategic vulnerability, especially when this whole mess was started by the U.S., not by any failure in Canada. So where does all this leave Canada? Well, it's really important to see that this wasn't just some knee-jerk reaction to tariffs. When you zoom out and look at the government's other moves, this whole steel fortress plan starts to look like the final piece of a much larger puzzle.
The picture gets way clearer when you look at the timeline. You have millions for Buy Canadian policies, a $51 billion infrastructure fund that prioritizes Canadian materials, and a $63 billion defense plan to, get this, diversify away from American suppliers. The steel fortress wasn't a reaction, it was the capstone of a very carefully built plan.
At the end of the day, you can really see this as a story of two leaders, both building walls, but for totally different reasons. Trump built a tariff wall to try and force Canada to submit. In response, Carney started building a policy fortress, one made of cold, hard economic math, not concrete, designed to make sure Canada could stand on its own 2 feet.
You know, this policy marks a huge psychological shift. For the first time, Canada is building an industrial strategy that basically assumes the American market might never be fully reliable again, and that this isn't a disaster, but maybe, just maybe, it's an opportunity. You could argue it's the first real step toward genuine economic adulthood. But it leaves us with one final big question. Is this a true act of sovereignty that's going to build a stronger, more resilient Canada? Or is it just a very expensive way to delay an economic reckoning that's bound to happen anyway?